The evening bells tolled, their quiet, mournful sound echoing in the stillness of the room. It was a sound that seemed to tear through the deep darkness, landing with a heavy, leaden weight in the pit of my stomach. It was on that day, I now know, that the gears of fate began to turn quietly, but with absolute certainty. "David, rest easy now, my sweet boy," I whispered. My voice was so faint it seemed to be swallowed by the thick, carpeted silence. Absorbed by the very walls of the funeral home, the chill in the air bit at my skin, a cold so sharp it made me want to shrink into myself. And it was in that cold, quiet moment that I finally noticed it. I noticed the empty chair. This was the day we were saying our final goodbye to my youngest son. His older brother, Michael, should have been sitting beside me, and next to him, his wife, Susan. We were meant to be 3 generations, standing together in our grief beside the simple, polished wood of the casket. We were supposed to be a family, united in this unbearable loss, but her chair was empty. A hollow, gaping space in the front row, near the casket, on a small table overflowing with floral arrangements, someone had placed a single, large wreath of white flowers. Perhaps it was a gesture of obligation, I thought. It stood there, stark and sterile, swaying almost imperceptibly in a draft I couldn't feel. The sight of it sent a single, silent word piercing through my heart. "I'm so sorry, Mom." A low voice seemed to brush past my ear, a fleeting whisper in the solemn air. But when I turned, there was no one there. It must have been a trick of the mind, a phantom sound born from the heavy, grief-stricken atmosphere of the room. A storm of emotions, tears, anger, and a deep, aching sorrow for my son swirled within me, churning and mixing until they coalesced into a single, burning question. "Why aren't you here?" That question, I knew, must have been a heavy weight on the heart of every person in our family. And yet, as the service concluded and people began to file past the casket to pay their last respects, a solid wall of silence stood between us all. No one spoke of it. No one met my eye. Finally, I spoke. "If I may, I'd like to say just one more thing," I said. My gaze was fixed on the dais where my son lay sleeping, and as I spoke, my voice was quiet but steady. "I want you to burn this into your heart," I began, letting the words hang in the still air. "I want you to understand what a dull, cruel blade your silence has been." There was no malice in my voice, no trace of hysterics. It was not an accusation, nor was it a lament. It was simply a statement of profound and unshakable conviction. The moment the words left my lips, the atmosphere in the funeral home seemed to freeze. A hush fell over the room, so complete it was as if the air itself was holding its breath. My daughter-in-law, who had, by some miracle, finally appeared, did not break her long-held silence. She simply stood with her back to me, her shoulders rigid, offering nothing. After that, no one exchanged a word. The candles on the altar were slowly, carefully extinguished, and one by one, people began to leave. I, too, turned and walked out into the encroaching darkness. Long after the last candle was snuffed out, long after I left that place, the echo of that day's screaming silence has remained, lodged deep within my heart. And I am still asking the same question. Why weren't you there? This story is the record of the 458 days it took to find the answer. It is a journey to uncover the secrets, the hidden wounds, and the deep emotional scars that lay buried within our family. It is a story about what it means to be a mother, a wife, and a human being, what it truly means to live. The journey to unravel it all is about to begin. If you wish to know more, I invite you to join me in the next chapter. This is a story of the fierce conflicts that hide behind the facade of a family, of the small kindnesses and moments of forgiveness that no one ever saw, and of the final, heart-wrenching moment of rebirth that awaits at the end of the long road. I ask you only to listen to this quiet question with an open heart. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I am 76 years old. My husband passed away more than 20 years ago, and since then, I have lived not with my daughter, but with my sons. I was once a nurse at a hospital in Cleveland, but after my retirement, all I truly wanted was a quiet, peaceful life. When my sons married and started their own families, It seemed natural that I would move in with my eldest, Michael. And for a time. Yes, for a while after I moved in, it was a warm and happy home. I can still see my grandson running to greet me when I'd come through the door, his small arms wrapped around my legs. I would laugh, forgetting my age, and those were truly joyful times. In contrast, there were days when I felt the cold, distant gaze of my daughter-in-law, Susan. At first, I tried to ignore it. She was always polite on the surface, of course, but her every action, every carefully chosen word, carried an undercurrent of resentment. There was a palpable feeling in the air that an unnecessary person had intruded upon their perfect little world. But I had another source of strength. My youngest son, David, he had stayed behind in Ohio, and he was my rock, my last fortress against the creeping loneliness. He was the one who always worried about his mother. His voice on the phone was always bright and full of affection, and the gifts he sent for every season came with notes like, hoping to send a little bit of a Cleveland spring to you in Philadelphia. One winter day, a package from David arrived. "Mom, it's getting cold out there," his letter read. "Please take care of yourself." Inside, I found a pair of warm, fuzzy socks with a cheerful snowman pattern. They looked so much like a pair he had made for me in a craft class when he was just a little boy. In that moment, holding those socks, I thought to myself, I am so lucky to have this boy. But that feeling was always followed by a tightness in my chest as I thought about my daily life in Michael's house. The silent pressure from Susan grew heavier with each passing day. The long, uncomfortable silences at the dinner table. The cold, dismissive laugh that would cut off a story I was telling. The deep pang of loneliness I felt when she would deliberately turn her head away as I spoke to her. I remember it so clearly, the night the family took me out to dinner for my retirement. I was nervous, but I stood up to make a small toast. "I just want to thank you all," I said. "I'm looking forward to a slower pace of life now." For a brief second, Susan smiled, but then her expression hardened. "Well, you don't have to be so formal about it," she said, her voice dripping with a cool condescension. "If it makes you uncomfortable, you really don't have to say anything at all." Her words were like a small, sharp knife, piercing a soft part of my heart I didn't know was so exposed. There I was, surrounded by family, and yet I had never felt more like I didn't belong. But David was there. On the way home that night, he walked me to the door. He took my hand and said, "Mom, you have a right to your own life. You've earned this time for yourself. And I'm always on your side. Don't you ever forget that." His words were a balm on my wounded spirit. It was that bond, that unwavering connection with him, that allowed me to hold on to some warmth in my life. I have so many precious memories. I remember the long avenues lined with cherry blossoms my boys and I would walk down when they were children. I remember the faces of the patients I cared for at the hospital, the lives I saw begin and end. I remember a lifetime of sorrow and joy. All of those experiences formed the foundation of who I am, as a mother, as a nurse, as a woman, as a person. But in Michael's home, all of that seemed to mean nothing. The very concept of family had become twisted and distorted. I could hear the sound of my own belongings slowly eroding, a quiet, grinding noise in the backdrop of my quiet days. In Michael's house, my relationship with Susan was a source of constant, subtle friction, leaving a residue of unease over our daily lives. Even without words, the sense of alienation was impossible to ignore. It was as if my very presence threatened the core of the little family she and Michael had built. On the other hand, my bond with David was my only salvation, my only source of hope. His phone calls and letters were filled with, "Thank you" and "I love you," and even as the years advanced, he made me feel cherished and valued. The shape of our family had changed without me even realizing it. In the old days, after my husband's funeral, the three of us, me, Michael, and David had huddled together, supporting one another through the grief. We would have weathered this storm together. But now, in Michael's home, his wife had created a new, separate family unit, one that seemed to have no room for me. That realization cast a long, dark shadow over my heart. But David was different. He saw me. He acknowledged my value as a mother, as the person who had raised him and supported him. His words and his actions were the pillars that held me up. Now, saying all of this out loud, the past feels like a distant dream. The warm memories and the cold, hard realities wash over me in alternating waves. It was an experience more painful than I could have ever imagined, but it was also an opportunity to discover the depths of my own strength. It was the first step on a long journey to re-examine the question, what is a family really? It was near the end of the year, in 2024. In 2024, I was coming down the stairs when my foot suddenly slipped. The next thing I knew, I was in a hospital bed, staring up at a white ceiling and smelling the sharp, clean scent of antiseptic. You were lucky, the doctor told me. Another inch or two, and it could have been a much more serious injury. The thought sent a chill down my spine. During my entire hospital stay, only one person came to visit me, my son, David. He drove all the way from Cleveland to be there. Michael and Susan never once showed their faces. David sat by my bedside, his voice low and troubled. "Mom," he said quietly, "something's off with Michael lately. It's like, I don't know, it's like he's being manipulated. Susan's been telling him that you're a nuisance, that you're too much trouble. He seems so worn down by it all. He asked me to tell you, maybe, don't call so often for a little while." His voice was barely a whisper, but it trembled with a mixture of anger and sadness. His words were a small, quiet alarm bell, warning me of an invisible crack that was forming in the foundation of our family. After I was discharged, I returned to Michael's house, and soon the holidays were upon us. It was a time of year when the house should have been filled with noise and laughter. But that year, Michael, Susan, and their son did not come home for Christmas. For the first time in 30 years, our family was not together. "Looks like we won't be able to make it this year," was all Michael's email said. I stared at the words on the screen. But it was the unspoken fact that screamed at me. A 30-year tradition had simply vanished into thin air. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. A few days later, an old friend stopped by for a visit. She leaned in close, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Evelyn, I don't know if I should be telling you this," she said, "but I overheard some people talking the other day. They said your daughter-in-law Susan was telling them that, well, that since you're getting older now, they don't have to go out of their way to take care of you anymore." Her words were a cold blade, and the phrase, "don't have to take care of you," twisted in my gut. The reality that my very existence had become a burden to them was a painful, searing truth. The fall on the stairs, the lack of visitors in the hospital, the first Christmas we had ever spent apart, all of it began to stack up, and my vague anxiety slowly hardened into the certain knowledge that something was terribly wrong. That night, I lay awake in bed, tossing and turning. What was behind Susan's desire for me to be quiet? What did David mean when he said Michael had changed? The small feelings of unease were now growing into a massive, suffocating dread, and though I didn't know it then, my heart somehow sensed that all of this was just a prelude to a much greater shock, a far more devastating blow yet to come. "Oh God," I whispered into the darkness. Was I really just in the way? Even as I asked myself the question, I knew I could never abandon the part of me that was a mother. The fall down the stairs, it almost felt like a premonition, a cosmic push to get me out of their way for good. Then, one day in March of 2025, the news came. It was a phone call that shattered my world. My son, my David, had been involved in a serious car accident. He had been in Oklahoma, volunteering with a crew that was helping communities clean up after a series of devastating tornadoes. He was helping with the relief effort when the voice on the other end of the line trailed off. The words spun around and around in my head, and I couldn't form a response. "Evelyn, you need to..." "I'm so sorry, we don't. The situation is..." The voice cracked, unable to continue. I didn't need to hear any more. I just stood there, clutching the phone, my knuckles white. The funeral was held at a small church nearby. As I walked through the gates under the warm spring sun, The sweet scent of dogwood blossoms filled the air. The world was so peaceful, so beautiful, it felt like a cruel joke. "We appreciate you handling everything," I murmured to the pastor, who was arranging things at the entrance. When they placed David's photograph next to the casket, a wave of grief so powerful washed over me that I thought my heart would simply give out. The service began, and the sound of hymns filled the sanctuary. I clutched the prayer beads in my hand, my lips moving silently. "David, my boy, may you rest in peace." It was the only prayer I could manage. But as I sat there, lost in my sorrow, I became aware of a profound emptiness beside me. The seats reserved for our family, for my son Michael and his wife Susan, were glaringly, painfully empty. "Michael?" I pulled out my phone several times during the service, but he never answered my calls. A feeling of unreality began to set in, a numbness that spread through me, insulating me from a pain so immense it threatened to break me. Then, my phone buzzed. A single line of text from Susan appeared on the screen. "So sorry, can't make it." A conflict came up at work. We sent flowers. The simple, cold words on the screen were like shards of ice driven into my chest. My eyes filled with tears, blurring the message. I quickly put the phone back in my purse, unable to look at it any longer. "What have you done?" I screamed silently in my heart, while the sound of the organ washed over me, the notes feeling distant and hollow. The sorrow was just too big. It was a monstrous, all-consuming thing that had swallowed every other emotion, even anger. That day, the church was filled with countless bouquets and floral arrangements. Among them, one stood out, a massive, elaborate wreath of pure white lilies. The pastor pointed to it, whispering, "That one is from the immediate family, I believe." It was an impressive display, to be sure. But when I looked at the small card tucked into the ribbons, I saw that it was blank. There was no name. I picked up the card, turning it over in my hand as if a name might magically appear. But there was nothing. "No." From Michael and Susan, no. With deepest sympathy, not a single word. Just a cold, white, empty space. Just the words on a generic, store-bought card would have read, "With our deepest sympathies." The moment I saw that blank space where a name should have been, it felt as though a shard of ice had dropped deep into my chest. "Ah," I thought, a wave of cold clarity washing over me. "This is just a flower sent out of obligation." I couldn't help but feel it. A floral tribute sent without a heart, no matter how magnificent or expensive. Could never reach my own. In fact, that nameless, ostentatious wreath felt more like a monument to their rejection of me. I gently placed the blank card back where I'd found it, tucked among the white lily stems, and said nothing as I returned to my seat before the altar. There were no tears. They simply wouldn't come. Instead, I felt something deep inside my chest quietly, soundlessly, begin to crumble. Among the mourners were people from the disaster relief organization David had volunteered with and friends from his community. Countless flowers surrounded the framed photograph of his smiling face. I knelt softly before it, and alone in the silence of my own heart, I made a vow. "I will not let your life have been in vain. I will live for the both of us now. I will never, ever forget you." On the day of the funeral, the front pews of the church had been properly reserved for the family, and among them was a single chair, stark and isolated, that remained empty. It was the seat where my eldest son should have been sitting. It was the chair I had specifically asked to be placed there for him. No one said a word, but I could feel the collective gaze of the mourners shift, for just a moment, to that empty space. Even the pastor, in the middle of a scripture reading, glanced over at it, but not a single person mentioned the vacant chair. It was as if they had all silently agreed to pretend it wasn't there, to treat it as if it had never existed. But there is nothing more eloquent than an empty seat. The very fact of his absence made my presence there feel all the more starkly, shamefully, lonely. As I sat before the altar, I was suddenly struck by a strange and powerful feeling. I felt that I was being slowly, quietly stripped bare under the weight of everyone's gaze. Why isn't he here? Did something happen? No one dared to ask. But that very silence, the question that went unasked, was what stabbed at me the most. Dressed in black, my hands resting in my lap, I simply tried to breathe, to keep my composure. The tears had long since retreated, leaving a hollow ache deep in my chest. That empty chair wasn't just a physical absence. It was the physical manifestation of a broken heart, a severed connection. After the funeral was over, I swore to myself, deep in the quietest corners of my soul, that I had to know the reason why. That evening, I drove to my son's house. The streetlights cast long, thin shadows across the pavement, and I could feel my own heartbeat thumping a nervous rhythm against my ribs. I rang the doorbell, and the door opened almost immediately. Standing there was my daughter-in-law, Susan, her expression even colder than I had anticipated. "What is it?" she asked, her voice flat. I was ushered slowly into the house and sat down on the living room sofa. She let out an audible huff and dropped onto the cushion beside me. "I'm really not in the mood for this right now," she said before I could even speak. A few seconds of heavy silence passed before I found my voice. "I'd like you to tell me why you didn't come to the funeral." Susan sighed, a long, weary sound, and answered in a low tone. "I'm not trying to blame you, Evelyn, but the truth is, I wasn't that close to your other son. I don't have an obligation to go to a stranger's funeral, and I have the freedom not to attend." Her words were a knife, twisting in my chest. For a moment, I thought I might double over from the pain of them, but I forced myself to sit up straight and look at her. "But still, he was family. For me, he was my precious son and a part of your husband's life. He may have only been your brother-in-law, but does that connection truly mean so little?" At that, Susan gave a cold, sharp laugh, her voice rising slightly. "I'm sorry, but I have my own life to protect. My position is different from my husband's. A funeral is such an emotional affair. Spending the money and time to send flowers is more than enough." Her words squeezed the air from my lungs. Just then, my son Michael stood up from where he had been sitting quietly in the corner. He kept his eyes downcast as he spoke in a low voice. "Mom, please, don't say any more." But his words trailed off, unfinished. I could see it so clearly in his face. The hesitation, the conflict, the raw pain. In that instant, I stood up, my entire body rigid, and I spoke with a force that surprised even me. "Do you feel the same way they do, Michael?" He didn't answer. He just looked at me, his silence a confession. I pressed on. "If I were to die, would your wife not sit in that chair either? Would she say then, too, that I was just a stranger to her?" The silence returned, hanging thick and heavy in the room. He had no words to defend himself. He simply sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumped in defeat. And then, in a very quiet voice, I said one last thing, never imagining that it would become a blade that would freeze my family in place. "The blood I gave you to create your life. You're afraid of it now, aren't you? You're afraid to feel the pain of your own brother, of your own blood, a pain that I, as his mother, have no choice but to accept." The moment they heard those words, the color drained from Susan's face. I could see tears welling in Michael's eyes. But no one could speak. They just stared up at me, holding their breath as I stood over them. It felt as if time had stopped in that room for several long minutes. After the echo of my voice had faded, they remained silent. And so, I slowly turned and began to walk toward the front door. I have nothing more to say." My voice trembled, just slightly. Looking at their retreating figures in my mind, I understood something. New words don't always have to wound a person to hurt them. Sometimes, they can simply freeze them solid. It must have started to rain. The headlights of a passing car reflected off the wet pavement, casting a cold light on my back as I walked away. On the drive home that night, I asked myself a question. Was that it? Was that the last resort of a mother, a wife, a person who had spent her whole life raising a family? I didn't have an answer yet. There was only a heavy, dull ache that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. But I had said it. I had struggled, my voice shaking, to show them the unvarnished truth. And so, I kept walking. When I heard those cold words, "I don't have an obligation to go to my," Brother-in-law's funeral? A chilling shock ran through me, freezing me from the inside out. But on the way back home, I kept asking myself over and over again, why is she so cold? Why is she like that? I remembered the very first day I met her. It was before Michael had even proposed. She had come to my house to be formally introduced. She was wearing a proper dress, a soft smile playing around her eyes. Her words were polite, her manners impeccable. She even offered to pour the tea for me. A girl like this, I had thought, would surely fit right into our family. But a few months later, after the wedding was set, her attitude began to slowly change. She would be in the kitchen and murmur that the stew I made was a little bland. She started walking past the mantelpiece, where we kept a photo of my late husband, without so much as a glance or a nod of her head. One day, I happened to overhear her on the phone. "Look," she was saying, "I married him, I didn't marry his whole family. I'm honestly so sick of all their little traditions." It was then that I finally understood. For her, family wasn't about a bond of blood or a connection of the heart. It was something more like a contract. I learned later that she had grown up in a complicated home. Her parents had divorced, and she was raised by her mother. Life had been hard. There was a time when they were shuffled between relatives, and she had learned to survive by never opening her heart to anyone. Someone once said that people who aren't used to being loved don't know how to love others. In her world, family was a thing held together by obligation and distance. It was only natural, perhaps, that she would prioritize her own rules over a bond of blood. But that was precisely why I wanted my words to reach her. If only I had known more about her past. If only I had tried sooner to get closer to the pain in her heart. Behind her decision not to go to David's funeral, there were old wounds and fears, and a way of life built on protecting herself by not getting involved. But still, I wanted so badly to tell her. Family is supposed to be awkward, and messy, and difficult. But it's also about crying together and laughing together through it all. If there was even the tiniest bit of warmth left in her heart, I still find myself hoping, somewhere deep inside, that a day will come when those words finally reach her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let them see me cry. I had simply stood up quietly and was about to leave the room when a memory surfaced in my mind, a small wooden box that David had given me. "Mom, if something ever happens, please give this to someone." It had been a few days before he left for his volunteer trip. I had laughed and said, "Don't be so dramatic." David had looked a little embarrassed. "You never know what life has in store, right?" I think being prepared is a form of kindness. I had kept that box tucked away in a drawer ever since. I never had the courage to open it after that day. But now, I felt, was the time. I went home, found the box, and carefully wrapped it in a soft cloth. Then I drove back to Michael's house and put it in their mailbox. I did it in silence, without any explanation. Inside the box was a single letter, from David to me. "Dear Mom, if something happens to me, please don't blame Michael. He's always been the kind of person who can't stand up to people. I'm sure he's putting up with a lot in his life right now. I believe in him. I know that deep down, my brother is still the same kind person he always was. Doc, wait, when we were kids, there was a time I had a high fever and couldn't move. He carried me on his back all day long at the beach. I've never forgotten that. Click hack. Please help him remember that kindness inside of him again." Along with the letter, I had enclosed an old photograph. It showed two young brothers smiling on a sunny beach. Michael giving his little brother David a piggyback ride. That night, I couldn't sleep. I just stared at the moonlight and whispered to myself, "I hope your words reach them, my sweet boy." 3 days later, an envelope arrived in my own mailbox. There was no return address. Inside, there was nothing but a single sheet of blank paper. On it, in trembling handwriting, was just one word: "Sorry." I stared at it for a long time, then slowly closed my eyes. I felt the knot that had been tied in my heart for so long loosen, just a little. That one word, I thought, was probably the first time she had ever truly faced her own conscience. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, not by a long shot, But it was a first step. I put the envelope away, went out into the garden, and whispered to the small hydrangea bush as I watered it, "David, I think she might be able to change, just a little." And I resolved, then and there, to write to Michael one more time. This time, not as a mother, but as one human being to another. Quietly, gently, and with all my heart. A few weeks after that, I quietly packed my things and left my son's house. I didn't tell anyone I was going. As I gently closed the front door behind me, I felt a breeze at my back. It was as if something I had been clinging to for years had finally been released. My destination was a small senior living facility in the mountains of Vermont. It was an older place, but quiet, and a place where you could feel the changing of the seasons in your bones. At first, I didn't feel like talking to anyone. Food had no taste. At night, I would hear the sound of David's voice as a little boy echoing in my ears, and sleep wouldn't come. One day, as I was sitting by myself, one of the staff members came over and spoke to me softly. "Mrs. Carter," she said gently, "if you ever feel like, would you mind sharing your stories with everyone?" The other residents had been feeling a little down lately, I thought about. Her words for a moment, then gave a small, slow nod. And so, every Thursday afternoon, I began holding a story circle in the small common room. I didn't talk about myself, though. Instead, I told the stories of people who were never properly sent off. I spoke of the woman who waited for decades for her husband who never returned from the war. I told them about the father of a friend who passed away all alone. I shared the story of the elderly woman in the room next to mine, who slipped away quietly, with no one there to see her go. And at the end of every story, I would always say the same thing. I truly believe that as long as someone remembers them, a person can never completely disappear. The gatherings were more popular than I ever could have expected. The number of attendees grew week by week. Every time I saw someone quietly dabbing at their eyes with a handkerchief, I would remember what David had said to me. "I don't think Michael is a bad person, Mom." Not really. Around that time, a small article about my activities appeared in a local Vermont newspaper. "Mother forsaken at son's funeral finds new voice as a keeper of memories." The headline read. Below it was a small, grainy photo of my profile and another of the story circle in session. A few days later, a small envelope arrived at the facility. There was no return address, but inside, I found a letter written in a neat, careful hand. "Mom." Lately, I'd been taking my son to the cemetery every weekend. "Doc." We stand in front of David's picture, light a candle, and I talk to him. "Tea?" It turns out I loved my brother more than I ever thought I did. "Kalish. When I read that newspaper article about you, I couldn't stop crying. DS. I'm so sorry, this is the only way I know how to tell you how I feel. I've always been so awkward about things like this. S.M. Michael." I read the letter again and again, and a small smile found its way to my lips. "He hasn't changed a bit," I murmured to myself. Awkward from the moment he was born. Outside, a spring breeze rustled the window panes, and I could hear the faint, distant sound of children laughing. I quietly brewed a pot of tea, placed one cup on the mantelpiece in front of the little frame holding David's picture, and then whispered, "David, it looks like that letter you left for me finally got through to your big brother." On that day, I felt the cold wind that had taken root in my heart soften, just a little. It was a drizzly afternoon. Underneath the wisteria-covered pergola in the courtyard of the facility in Vermont, I sat alone on a damp bench, pouring tea into a small cup. Maybe no one else is coming, I thought. The thought had just crossed my mind when I heard the sound of footsteps near the entrance. I looked up to see a young boy standing there, holding an umbrella. He had a slender frame, a large backpack, and in his left hand he clutched a small lunchbox. The moment I saw him, something deep inside my heart stirred. "Whose grandson are you?" I asked, standing up and keeping my voice as gentle as I could. The boy closed his umbrella and slowly walked toward me. He looked me straight in the eye and said in a small voice, "I came to see my grandma." My dad said, "You should go by yourself." "My mom didn't want me to, but I wanted to meet you." His voice trembled. but his eyes held a clear, unwavering resolve. I was speechless. This boy, he was Michael's son, my grandson, and I had never, not once, met him until this very moment. The child I had only heard about, the child they had never let me see. Looking closely at his face, I saw a familiar resemblance. Not to Michael, but to him, to David. His smile was not like the one I remembered on Michael's face when he was a boy, running around holding his little brother's hand. It was the spitting image of his younger brother, David. I couldn't hold back the tears. I knelt down and gently wrapped my arms around him. I could feel the warmth from his small body seeping into me, and I felt the frozen core deep in my chest begin to slowly, gently thaw. "Thank you for coming," I managed to say. That was all I could get out. My grandson then held out the lunchbox. I didn't make this, but my dad and I picked it out together. He said it was something Uncle David used to like. Then he pulled a small wrapped package from his pocket. Inside was a single white handkerchief. In the corner, embroidered in clumsy, childish letters, were the words, "For Grandma." "I've always wanted to hear your stories." I clutched the handkerchief to my chest. The tears wouldn't stop, but they were no longer just tears of sorrow. "Will you come again?" I asked. My grandson nodded. "Yeah, maybe not every week, but can I bring some friends next time?" I smiled and answered, "Of course you can. Your grandma will have plenty of stories ready for all of you." That day, the sky was still a uniform gray, but for the first time in a very long time, I felt as though a ray of light had finally broken through into my heart. On another afternoon, I was in the small hall, telling my stories as usual. The story of an elderly couple who survived the turmoil after the war, the tale of a family separated for 30 years, finally reunited. The children's eyes shone with wonder, while some of the older residents occasionally dabbed at their eyes, listening in quiet contemplation. After the story ended and everyone began to head back to their rooms, a man approached me. His shoulders were thin, his hand rested on a cane, and his eyes had a faraway look. He was one of the residents I had rarely spoken with since moving in. He stopped in front of me and held out his hand. Surprised, I gently took it in mine. In a low, slightly trembling voice, he murmured, I wish I'd had a daughter like you." In that instant, it felt as if time had stopped. He continued, "I don't have any children. Well, I did, a long time ago, but they all left. It was my fault. I couldn't give them anything. But, listening to your story today, if there really is such a thing as a next life, I hope that next time, I can meet a child like you." Well, I couldn't say anything. I just held his hand tighter. I felt a small, warm light flicker to life deep in my chest. Perhaps what he said was just a kind word of comfort. But in his voice, I heard something real. I heard the truth. "Oh, thank you," I told him. He offered a faint smile, then slowly made his way back to his room. Family isn't just about blood ties. That thought came to me again, with renewed clarity. The hurts of the past, the betrayals I had endured, if all of that could somehow become someone else's wish for the future, then maybe it was all worth it. Maybe my life had been worthwhile after all. That's what I felt on that quiet afternoon. One afternoon, I was sitting in a corner of the dining hall, quietly sipping my tea. Through the window, I could hear children laughing and talking about something, around a small flower bed. The scene felt as if time itself had slowed down, and it kindled a warm light deep inside me. Just then, a little girl came up to me, tilted her head, and asked, "Hey, Grandma, if you ever saw that mean lady again, your son's wife, what would you do?" I couldn't help but smile. Children are so honest, and sometimes so cruel. But their innocent eyes hold a strength, a desire to know the truth. I answered her softly, "Well now, if I were to see her again, I think I'd like to make her a nice, warm cup of tea." "What? You wouldn't be mad?" "I'm too old to be mad anymore, sweetie. When you're young, you haven't lost enough to know what gratitude feels like. But when you get to be my age, you know the pain of loss. And when you know that pain, just hearing someone say they're sorry, that's more than enough." The little girl seemed to think about that for a moment, then nodded. Huh. She placed her small hand over mine. The warmth from her touch was strangely familiar, as if it were awakening a memory of my own family's warmth from long ago. In my heart, I spoke quietly. David, is she doing all right? And your brother? I wonder how he is now. You know, I'm still keeping a seat open for them in my heart. A place for someone to come back to. I've left it just as it is. I was never a perfect mother. I was strict at times. I overlooked things, and in the end, I lost something precious. But perhaps that's why I can wait so quietly now. I can look back without blame and smile at the small signs of a better future. Here in this facility, every day is the beginning of a new story. Listening to the innocent voices of children, being moved to tears by the stories of the elderly, and most of all, slowly, gently untangling the knots in my own heart. That is how my time passes now. My own story might be nearing its final chapter, but I hope that on the very last page, there will be the picture of someone's smile. And if this voice of mine can reach someone out there, please remember. Remember that in your heart too, there is still a seat left for someone. It seems like such a long, long story, and yet it also feels like it all happened just yesterday. Throughout my life, there have been so many happy times, so many sad times, more than I could ever put into words. I lost my husband, raised my children, held on to hope, and felt the sting of betrayal. But through it all, I kept reaching out my hand. I no longer hold a grudge for the words my eldest son's wife threw at me. At the time, my heart was wounded, and the pain blinded me to everything else. But now, I think she must have been carrying her own loneliness, her own fears. People who push others away are often just people who are afraid of something. It just took me a little while to understand that. And now, as I sit here on this quiet afternoon, holding a warm cup in my hands and looking out at the distant mountains, I find myself imagining the future. One more time, a dinner table with the whole family gathered around it. The steam rising from a pot of warm soup, fresh bread on the table, and the sound of someone's laughter. A future where my seat is still there waiting for me. There's no guarantee that such a future will ever come. But surely I'm allowed to dream of it, aren't I? Forgiving someone isn't for their sake. It's for your own, to lighten the burden on your own heart. I have already let go of so much. But in its place, I feel a quiet light glowing in the deepest part of my soul. That light is David's smile. It's the single word, sorry, that Michael wrote. It's my grandson's voice saying, I wanted to meet you. And it is the proof that I, myself, never stopped believing in others. Life is a strange thing, isn't it? In the end, what remains is not anger, not regret, but a quiet, thank you, and the feeling, I still love you. Have you ever attended a funeral where the people who should have been there were missing? Have you ever seen the back of a mother, all alone, placing flowers before a photograph on the mantelpiece? Perhaps, in your own life, there are unspoken words of, I'm sorry, and thank you, lying dormant. If there is still a seat for your mother left in your heart, please, let us know in the comments. Tell us, Mom, I haven't forgotten. And if this story has left even the smallest, quietest echo in your heart, would you consider following our channel? So that when you feel lost somewhere along your own journey, you can always come back to this voice. And so that through someone else's story, you can remember the people who are precious to you. May our small stories be a gentle reminder of the kindness that lives within you.